So today I probably want to talk about South Park bigger, longer, and uncut. And to me, this is one of the greatest films ever made, and definitely one of the most important animated films, and definitely one of the most important musicals ever made. And I do want to tell you guys a funny but personal story really first. That in the 1990s, I went to summer camp, and I remember we were watching. I think it was like the Blair Witch Project that people wanted to see, and I wasn't really into horror films at that time, so we were watching some other movies. So like me and the camp counselor, we snuck into Tarzan, then we snuck into South Park the movie, and I saw the South Park movie from like the Conan O'Brien skit all the way until like the fart when Kenny farts on a match and then he has that surgery scene. So, it was kind of cool to just see a little bit of it. And they also said at that time Wild Wild West with Will Smith was very popular because what a lot of kids would do was that they would buy a ticket to that movie, then they would sneak into South Park bigger, longer, and uncut. And I remember my dad saying, like, you're not going to see the movie because, it's inappropriate, but also there's jokes that you won't get, like, bigger, longer, uncut. You don't get that. That's a dick joke, So I was born in 1987, so definitely South Park the movie was like something that a lot of kids were pissed off about because their parents would not let them see it for obvious reasons, and then also too, you know, when you watch it like 20 years later, when you're older, it's not as funny because cursing was very funny when you were a kid. So I wanted to talk about this film in a lot of different areas. So like the film is about the four South Park kids, Cartman, Kyle, Stan, and Kenny, and they all go see the Terrence and Phillip movie. And Terrence and Phillip is supposed to be in the South Park world an allegory for South Park and the controversies it faces. Like, it's definitely like as I call a meta reference. And they watch the movie and all shit breaks and all hell breaks loose because Kyle's mother is really upset with like Kyle's behavior, and she gets to a point where she blames everybody, which starts a war and causes a lot of chaos. And before I start talking about my feelings about this film, I do want to say that this film was nominated for an Oscar for Blame Canada. And I really want to dissect this first. And I think that it's a very good song, and it was rightfully so nominated for an Oscar. Like, I do think that it's definitely a satirical song about, like, we should engage in war, we should blame other people, and sometimes we should blame other cultures if they create media that's very, very popular in the US that children like, and we just disagree with it because it's either violent or something else. So it's just like the idea of scapegoating and encouraging scapegoating. And again, because it is South Park, it is satire, because we all know that Sheila's wrong. That the thing that you should always do as a parent is discipline your children and have conversations like saying, you may like this piece of content, like South Park or whatever, but you don't watch that show because my value is that I don't want to teach is that I don't want you to be exposed to crude humor or inappropriate dialogue, because then it becomes very inspiring for you to kind of repeat that and get yourself in trouble. You know, that's the conversation to have. And I also will say that it's a bit of an allegory, like I was talking about in my Pokemon video, that South Park reminds me a lot of Japanese anime. Like when Pokemon came out, and there was a bunch of kids that had parents that exposed them to different types of anime. And then also too with Tanami, that's when people were inspired by Dragon Ball. Well, that's when people got into Dragon Ball Z a lot more, Rurouni Kenshin, and a lot of different shows. And I think that one big thing a lot of parents saw at that time was like, holy shit, like look at these Japanese cartoons, they're super violent, and you have characters like Goku like having blood on him, or Kenshin having blood on him. So it definitely kind of inspired, some parents to be like, okay, you're not gonna watch anything Japanese because it's too violent, or we're gonna teach our kids to kind of be like, oh, well, Japanese culture is too violent or whatever. So it kind of makes me think of the Blame Canada song where she's like talking about the Canadians and their beady little eyes and whatever, because she's encouraging, without realizing it, to be anti, not just against the Terrence and Phillips show to be anti-Canadian because it's also like how different cultures have different values, you know. And I also want to start talking about this film, like just like the themes about it. And I think like the main one of the themes I want you to talk about is American hypocrisy, because I do like what the Canadian Prime Minister was saying to Sheila, that you know when you look at Terrence and Phillip in the Canadian culture, profanity and fart jokes are very accepted, but when you look at American content, violence is more accepted, and that's very, very true. You know, you look at films like The Godfather, Bonnie and Clyde, and the Terminator, Rambo, and also too in the 1940s, you could show gory war footage because it was kind of seen as showing what war was really like, and even during the Vietnam War. But also too that you know you look at the news, and the news is not like rated 14 or rated MA, and violence in American media is very, very prominent. But it's funny like how like you hear in the Good Times with Weapons episode that you know if people don't worry about violence when there's sex stuff to worry about. People are more upset with Trey Parker and Matt Stone in the 90s because of the profanity and crude humor versus versus like you know when they look at other shows and violence and everything like that. So sometimes it is about that hypocrisy, how you can call out something for being violent, but you can't call out but you know like how people in America would call out shows for being profane or too sexual, or maybe some violence in kids shows, but a lot of American media is extremely violent. So there's a level of hypocrisy. And then I think the next big thing is just, you know, the 1990s latchkey generation. For those of you who don't know, latchkey means that kids did not really grow up with their parents because their parents were too busy working, or sometimes even like protesting or whatever. You saw more protesting in like the 60s and 70s with the Vietnam War, but there were people protesting South Park and other things like that. And latchkey also means that like a lot of kids had to raise themselves, so the parents were not really in the household. Like I was a latchkey kid because I remember like in middle school how my parents would be working, so during like the school breaks I would be seeing my parents for like 8 or 9 hours a day. And nowadays people can consider that child abuse, but that's just how it was back when I was a kid. You know, you were there home, you know, all day. And it's also crazy because nowadays people are more concerned about perverts and predators. So there's some people who are like, you know what, you know that could be a form of child abuse or child neglect. But back in the 90s, that was very, very common. So ultimately, you know, there are kids missing their parents. There are kids watching TV, figuring out things for themselves. There were kids who could invite other friends over, experiment with sex and drugs. Or there are people like me, like who I remember, like sometimes, like I would sneak out in the 90s and go to a couple of stores, and there'd be some like you know bad stuff that I would be doing out on the streets when I was like you know in middle school, and some bad stuff I did at home, and ultimately, should I really blame? Ultimately, as an older, I blame myself, but I think at the time you blame your parents. But you can't be like, okay, well, my kids watch this show or that show, or that show is very popular, so I have to just start blaming everybody but my kid. And I think that that's also very, very important. I also think that another big theme in this whole episode is the cancel culture, because you know this is definitely you know 20 years before what we see nowadays with the cancel culture. Like obviously I think that when you need a film like this, it needs to be shown or even released in theaters again, because really the big problem with cancel culture is that it is a form of fascism and terrorism and totalitarianism, if I'm saying it correctly, because you see like how Sheila will not stop until she gets the execution of Terrence and Phillip, and then also you see a lot of people supporting her violence. And that's kind of like an allegory to like how people, you know, if there's a celebrity who does something wrong, people will do cyberbullying. Sometimes they may harass somebody, or you look at something like the you look at something like like with all like the shootings of African Americans, George Floyd, um, Trayvon Martin, a few other one, and other people where people decided, where some people decided to protest rightfully, and then there's other people decided to engage in acts of violence, and that's also very very true with a lot of different people. Like I've seen like sometimes there's people who don't wear a face mask, and then there's people who run up to them and just put masks on their face. Like that's technically assault. Or there's people like who want to protest, kneeling for the flag, and then there's people who grab those kids or whatever in school and just like force them to stand up because it's two different people with two different philosophies. So when you look at a movie like this, it kind of is talking about that danger of, well, because we have a disagreement over philosophies, I'm allowed to put my hands on you. I'm allowed to engage in domestic terrorism, and just because I may have a mob behind me and mob mentality, I'm going to get my way. And that's kind of been a big issue in the American system now. Because, anytime there's somebody that's singled out for whatever reason, we people can use violence against that person, or people can bully that person to go they want or make up lies or whatever. So there's always this type of singling people out, and you see that with Sheila's character with Terrence and Phillip. And I would also kind of say that I think another thing that I would say is that the V chip is one thing I want to talk about, because I kind of liked. To me, it's like kind of an allegory for medication and also like how some other people use medication as a way to discipline their kids. Like they put a V chip in Cartman's head, so each time he curses, he gets shocked. So there's also people who rely on medications to solve their issues with their kids, and it's almost like having something in your body that's going to prevent you from doing what you want to do. So it also is kind of like a way of saying, you know what, I don't, like instead of actually being a parent and controlling your kid or teaching your kids why you shouldn't swear or look at content that has a lot of profanity, other things like that, it's just saying, you know what, this is the cheapest way to solve my problem. And then also we're going to ignore the side effects, because obviously, if you have something like a V chip and it's giving you jolts, they've kind of proven that when you have something like that creates a shock in somebody, or you put a collar on a dog to prevent them from barking with a shock collar, that teaches fear. That also can lead to biological problems later on in life. So that's what I kind of feel as well. And there's a few other things I want to talk about as strengths and weaknesses about the movie. I think that some of the weaknesses are of the movie that I think, like when you look at the 50-minute mark, some of the musical feels some of the musical songs kind of feel very flat, or like, what, you did it a couple of times, so stop having some musical numbers. Like I think like the worst ones are really Satan's musical number, Saddam Hussein's musical number, and it really picks up with Big Gay Al, because I think like with Satan, Saddam was saying like, yeah, there are characters in South Park, but they're not overly featured. And I also kind of think that Satan and Saddam's relationship was kind of the weakest part of the whole movie. Like obviously it drove the plot forward, but I do think that they were not like really the ultimate antagonists. And I think that was kind of like one of the big issues with this movie, is that really you had three antagonists. You had Satan, Saddam Hussein, and Sheila Broflovsky. But Sheila Broflovsky is the ultimate antagonist. And actually, like they say in some movie scripts, like the person who changes is the main character. Like technically, if you want to know who is the main character of this movie, it's actually Sheila Broflovsky, because she learns that just because that she's going about her issue in the wrong way. If she wants to make the world a better place, it isn't just taking things to an extreme, to a point where you're kidnapping people and forcing them to be tortured because you feel like they corrupted your youth, your children. You make the world a better place by raising your children and disciplining them, and it's just saying, this is why you can't watch a show like Terrence Phillip or see that movie, because it's very encourageable. And then ultimately, if you use profanity, there are situations where you can lose a job, or people can take it as sexual harassment, or some people can take it as such a bad insult that they can just shoot you over nothing. So I think that the fact that they had three antagonists and they didn't really focus too much on Sheila, even if he said maybe she was like this because of her backstory or whatever, I think that he focused on that element, you would have made a stronger film. But I really think that I really just think that they really wanted to focus on the main characters a lot more, which is the four South Park boys. And I think that honestly they did focus on Sheila a little bit more, and maybe a little bit of a backstory of why she was like that. If he gave maybe he had an extra 20 minutes focusing on that, I think you would have a stronger film. And I do agree with what I said. That I think that because they throw in a couple of musical numbers like the Satan one and the Saddam Hussein one, and then even the Big Gay Al one at the end, even though it was kind of necessary. Big Gay Al, I do think that it does become a little monotonous. I do think Blame Canada is the best one. I also like the opening one with Stan just introducing the whole movie, and then I also liked Shut Your Face, Uncle Fucker, because I think I really like how that was kind of when they started to curse and stuff like that, because then that's kind of because that's also good pacing, and I think that that's one of the strengths of this movie is really, really good pacing. So those are my three favorite songs, and I'm going to talk about some of the strengths. I think the editing is done very well. I think this movie is very, very well paced, even though it gets monotonous in the third act, but the pacing is really, really good in most of the movie, and the editing is really good. It's definitely a lot of great reaction shots. And also for a movie that has 399 curse words, they do a really good job of just pacing it. So it isn't just it's there to be said. It's almost like they know how to it's just like the episode where they say the word shit over 150 times, where they just know how to keep using that word without it getting old. But when they want to make it old in the episode, it actually feels old. So it's very amazing that they can curse close to 400 times, and you can watch this and say, oh, it doesn't feel a little too ridiculous, or it feels like a little too monotonous, or it feels like a middle schooler trying to be profane as possible. I think that they just influx their writing so well with satire that when you watch this doesn't feel like somebody trying to break a record for how many curse words or whatever. I also think they do a good job with focusing on the characters that you care about, like Chef's in the movie, and also there's something I ought to say that I don't like, and then also Big Gay Al, Satan, Saddam Hussein, the South Park moms, they're all really important characters. And one other big thing I think is a weakness of this film is that Chef does not have a song. And I do think that would have also helped too, because this is Isaac Hayes. He won the Oscar for Shaft, so I think it would have been good if they figured out a way to give him a song. And as I said, that if they kind of wanted to make this an hour, a 2 hour movie, I would say they should have focused on Sheila, give her 20 minutes of character development, or even a backstory how she turned into that. And then how she turned into just a very vindictive and tearing down person, because I think that could come from childhood. And I also kind of think that another thing is that they could have just had Isaac Hayes do one or two songs, because he did the theme song for Shaft. So obviously with the Academy Awards, they would probably would have liked to kind of sing a repeat or something like that. And it obviously would have helped the movie a lot more, because obviously Isaac Hayes was the name. And another thing that I would say that I like about the films is that they have a lot of celebrity cameos. I do think that George Clooney. I think if I'm right, I think George Clooney's in this movie. Like he plays like the surgeon during Kenny's surgery. So I do like how they incorporate celebrities who want to be on the show, and they were also Trey Parker and Matt Stone were told that when they were younger to incorporate celebrities because that way you get more attention. And I think that that's a smart move as well because it also makes it feel realistic when you have them do every voice and then you have like real celebrities doing real people because it kind of makes you kind of ask yourself, what's real and not real. And I think that there's a lot of other talking points. I do think that another thing that I'm not really a fan of, but it works for the movie, is that they kind of are inspired by Les Miserables towards the end of the film. So it does feel like a little bit like copycatting, but I see like why they did that. And I also think that another thing I like is just like the South Park characters do grow, like the kids grow as well because they learn to stand up to their moms. And I think that other thing about that is that it's beautiful because it does show that they love their moms and their moms love them, but they don't know how to express their love to each other. And that's kind of a human thing, is that families just don't know how to express their love to each other. Like everybody does their role, or sometimes ego gets in front of how we choose to love our family members. And I think that sometimes that creates a lot of sadness. And I see that with even in my own family. But I do think that definitely one of the issues I do see with Sheila and her relationship with Stan and all the other South Park moms is it's really about ego and narcissism and getting fired up. And sometimes that's one of the reasons why South Park and other shows are so successful at that time, is because, as Eric Bischoff said, controversy sells. Obviously when people are fired up, they want to be heard, and people want to talk about how bad they feel about something, and everybody has the right to do that. It's a human thing. And sometimes I think when we kick it up a notch, a couple of decibels, we kind of forget that we're not in the right as well. And, to talk about the 48-hour film project, I know I've talked about my feelings with the competition, and I've kind of said that, I've definitely seen things like bullying, people talking about my race. And I remember like sharing a story where I overcame suicide and depression, and I remember how some event runners and other people were not really respecting what I was saying. So I remember like for a long time I've mentioned the things about people bullying people in that competition, and also just unprofessionalism and rudeness. But one thing I kind of forgot that while I was making all that noise was that, it's kind of like almost going out for dinner and having a bad meal, but instead of just leaving one bad review, you leave a bad review every single day. And then also just not realizing too that when I've done the 4-hour film project, it's helped me overcome travel anxiety and other things as well. So sometimes, from the example I'm saying in my life, that sometimes when there's things that upset us, it's so easy to make a bunch of noise, and it's so easy just to be super negative that you don't realize that you're creating a bigger problem, or you're digging a hole for yourself or other people. When Sheila kind of had to ask herself, okay, well, I'm upset by this, but how far should I take my response? And I think that that's a human thing. And I think that that's also another theme within this is anger management. Like, how far do you take your response when you are offended by content, or even when you have kids and they're into content that you disagree with, or something's just generally offensive. And I've made that mistake when I've done the 48-hour film project, where, there were some things that were offensive to me, but how far I took it was not appropriate. And I think that that's a human thing. Like when we have a disagreement over something controversial, or a movie or anything that's controversial, how far do we take it? And sometimes when we talk badly, we tend to make it hyperbole. Like I think like when I was watching some old footage of Trey Parker, Matt Stone, and the Conan O'Brien show in the 90s, they were saying that some people were saying that the South Park movie was from the pits of hell, and some people were saying like it's evil, or it's satanic and other things like that. When actually you watch it and it's not really that. It's a very, very biting satire. So it's interesting like how sometimes people just, get so offended by something they just rely on hyperbole a lot, or sometimes they just cause a reaction that's inappropriate. Like, it's very surprising that Trey Parker and Matt Stone, like, people were, because this happened to some celebrities. Like, there were celebrities that were getting pied, and then there's some celebrities that would wear fur coats and people would throw blood on them, or there could have been domestic terrorism, or there were like school shootings in the 90s, so there could have easily been shootings at the South Park studio. It could have been escalated really, really badly for Trey Parker and Matt Stone. And I think that if it got to that level, they would have never continued on with South Park. Like, there wouldn't be South Park, almost their 30th season right now if it got escalated to that level. But it does kind of go back to what I'm saying about how it's unfortunate that sometimes when people get offended, they are focused on expressing their feelings, that they don't stop to realize that, their reaction is an overreaction, and ultimately they're taking time away from their own lives, the lives of their kids, and then also their self-preservation, because, Kyle's mom's a bitch, instead of Kyle's mom is looking out for everybody. So, there's a lot of talking points in this film. And I think this is a very, very powerful piece of animation. I do think that really after the South Park movie, because there are some people who watched it on Comedy Central, it got very popular, but back in the 90s, movies were also a big way of making something very popular. This was kind of maybe the first like adult animation that really was commercially successful, that really was successful in a lot of different areas. Obviously there's Ralph Bakshi's Fritz the Cat, but that was more underground. This was not really underground, so this was everywhere, and it was even nominated for an Oscar for its music. But this was kind of like the first time you saw an adult animation really just as a movie accepted in the mainstream. And I think that that's really amazing, because obviously it did show that adult animation could be is a more acceptable genre. Like, I really think that Family Guy would not be so violent and gory without the South Park movie. If you look at shows like Beavis and Butthead, or even you look at a lot of kids' animations, like, you look at, I don't know, like even Kurt's Cowardly Dog, where, sometimes if a character screams or whatever, sometimes they scream out their skeleton, or like, so there's some kids shows that have some gore in it, or even like SpongeBob was there's some gore in SpongeBob, and it's like Y7. All that I think kind of comes from South Park the movie, because it made like violence and animation so mainstream, but it also was saying that, everybody can handle a little bit of dark humor. Like South Park did change the world, and I do think that it's very unfortunate that I do think it should have been nominated for Best Animation, and it also should have been nominated for Best Picture. Like, I think it easily should have been nominated for Best Picture, because obviously of its satire and its social relevance at the time. And also too, it should have like won an Oscar for, groundbreaking film, because it really changed animation. So it really changed animation forever. So it really didn't get the recognition that it really deserved. And I think I would say even Best Editing should have been nominated for it, but I do think that the writing is good for it. I would even like say it as a weak nomination, but I do think that the thing that hurts South Park the movie is that they really, really just wanted to put in close to 400 swear words, because they were told that for it to be NC-17, it had to be 400 curses. So do 399. So I think that even though the cursing doesn't feel too monotonous, and they pace it very, very well, I do think that, and I do think that also because some of the songs feel a little just repetitive, that I can't consider this like a script on the level of being Oscar nominated. I do think that as I said, that if they really expanded on Sheila's backstory and made you kind of care for her, maybe like her mom was the same way during the 1970s with sexism or something like that. If you kind of tied in maybe more Sheila's backstory, maybe her mom was kind of the same type of bitch or whatever, I think you would have had a stronger film then. And I think that would have taken it to a level of winning awards because you would have had more character development. But I do think that, for a first draft of a movie, they did a really, really great job. And if ultimately this was the send off for South Park, because they actually thought that this was going to be their send off, because they felt like South Park was going to be a fad, not something that they're going to be doing for at least 20 to 25 more years, I would have kind of been like, I would have said that this is more of a treasure for that reason, but it's definitely a very important film. And it's one of the most important animation films. Like, I don't think it's even in the top 10 America Film Institute's top animations, but it definitely should be. And definitely one of the greatest musicals ever made, because it was one of the first musicals that I think used contemporary satire so appropriately and successfully. And I think the last thing that I would say as a criticism is that when Chef is in the military, they have Operation Darky, where it's like all the black characters have to be human shields. Like, they repeat that joke later in another episode where there's a bunch of hippies and Chef has to kind of go out and sacrifice himself, because there's a stereotype, because in a lot of old films they did stuff where the black characters have to die for the white characters. So again, I do think that one of the weakest things about the movie is that Chef is such a very popular character that maybe he could have even made a song about that. But if you're gonna feature a character like Chef and talk about racism, they should have just done a little bit more. Just say like, okay, well, maybe there should be a boot camp scene, or make it like Full Metal Jacket and Chef getting double standards because he's black, and then kind of roll with that, because there are double standards in the military. Like, even if you watch Full Metal Jacket, Arlie Ernie's character talks about like everybody being equally worthless, and then after he says that, he calls the black private Snowball, and then he tells him that you're probably not gonna like that we don't serve fried chicken and watermelon on a daily basis. So there's racism in the military. So they easily could have put a satire about that. So if they had this movie be like an hour, 120 minutes, which is really, really, really more commercial than an 88-minute movie, they would have an extra. This is 88 minutes, so they would have an extra 32 minutes. If they did 32 minutes, 60 minutes of Chef and 60 minutes of Sheila Broflovsky with a backstory, and Chef being a satire for racism in the military, and that alone, and maybe doing a song about it, I think you would have had a way, way stronger film. You would have taken it from what I would think is like a B+ film to more of an A or A+ type of movie. And it probably would have been nominated for more Oscars. But I do think that, the South Park creators, this is their attempt at making a movie. They did a great job with it. They obviously had a very, very hard time getting this without an NC-17 rating, and they couldn't make this film NC-17 because they wouldn't have made a lot of money, because those films don't get marketed, and they're not really shown in a lot of theaters. So I think that, for them to get an R rating, they had to work a lot. They had to work a lot into fighting with the rating system and other things. So I do think that took away from all the creativity that they could have put in there, because it's definitely a mental frustration. But I think that those two things I said would have made it a better film. But overall, one of the greatest films ever made. I'm very happy to watch this, knowing that they're going to start their next season in a couple of days. So South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. One of the greatest films ever made, and I'm very proud to have reviewed it.